The founder of the Royse law firm, and our presentation today is on offshoring, strategies for success, operational, legal, and business issues. We have two speakers today that I will introduce, but you should have on your screens, if you are logged in, a text box on the right-hand side of your screen. If you have questions, please type your question into that text box, and we'll save them for the end of the presentation, and the speakers will answer them. All attendees will be in a silence mode until the end of the presentation. Attorney Satya Narayan of the Royse law firm focuses her practice on intellectual property protection, licensing, and commercial transactions. She represents clients ranging from startups to established public companies and multinationals. Her clients include software, e-commerce, cloud, digital media and content, semiconductor, solar, and medical device companies. She assists clients with identifying and protecting intellectual property assets and provides counsel on best practices in technology, including open source, commercial, and privacy issues. Satyanaryan is president of Offshoring Success, LLC, an advisory firm specializing in improving the effectiveness of offshore centers. In addition to pioneering work in offshoring for over 2 decades, he has provided leadership to product development and IT organizations. Prior to Offshoring Success, he was the senior executive at a Fortune 500 company and founder and CEO of a startup. He's helped dozens of executives across industries address a broad range of offshoring issues. He is author of Offshore Development and Technical Support and a speaker at industry conferences. And with that, I am going to turn this over to Sath.
Good morning, everyone. We have a group of people the group is spread between the service providers and people who are actually users of offshore outsourcing. So let's go to the first slide. Okay. So I'll give you a quick overview of the presentation to follow, the topics. The vendor selection process, we're going to look at it both from the perspective of people who are users of outsourcing services and also from the service provider side. So again, because of the audience that we have this morning, we'll present to you the best practices, what works, what each party should do to make it work for everybody. The next topic we're going to get into is project management. This is where I'd like to call, this is where the rubber meets the road. You can lay out all the strategy for offshoring and outsourcing, but at the end of the day, you're executing a number of projects, and we will talk about best practices that make it work. Deadlines and productivity. How do you keep projects on track? This is again related to the project management issue, but we will go into more in depth about how do you manage deadlines and what you can do to deal with offshore productivity. And in the case, the next item that we're going to talk about is vendor employees. How do you best work with them? And we will take a look at both from the legal aspect, from the operational aspect, what are the best practices. The last item is global teams. You know, in today's environment, companies are spread all over the world. You have multiple locations around the world, and even service providers have multiple locations around the world. So it becomes an increasingly complex environment to manage. I'm not saying it is true for everybody, but we are finding that to be true of a lot of people. So Satya will have some good advice on what you need to do. With that, let's go to the next slide, the vendor process. There you go. Okay. I've been helping companies for the last 20 years or so roughly in finding the right vendors to meet their outsourcing strategies. You know, if I find one major issue that I find in all of this is quite often the vendor selection process ends up as a simply price only or price oriented decision making. When you are doing offshore outsourcing, it really does not work. What happens is people go set up a contract, throw it over the wall because of the price, and hopefully things will work for them. And it doesn't work for the vendor, it doesn't work for the users of offshoring, or buyers, as you may want to think about it. So here are some other things I think that you need to think about when you select a vendor. Again, from the buyer's perspective, you need to take a look at your actual priorities. What is the strategy? Why are you going there? Cost is definitely one consideration, but a lot of other people, I find a lot of other factors, such as access to skill set, can you scale up and scale down? There are a range of things. So you really need to understand why you are going, and cost figures in as just one aspect. The second reason you are going offshore is to get access to staff, and you want good, competent staff. Now, when you're getting started, until you get the relationship really established and established well, I encourage my clients to work with the service providers to be very clear on the requirements. You may even want to take a look at the resumes. You may want to conduct phone interviews. On occasion, I've had line managers from our organization really go offshore, work hand in hand with the vendor to make sure that we get the right people to get started. Now, over time, everybody really understands what the requirements are. These things you may not have to do as much, but initially that's a very important thing to do to make sure the whole initiative succeeds over time. Now, what kind of vendors would you pick? Here is one other consideration. We live in Silicon Valley, and a lot of the startups come to me and say, I really want to go to do some offshoring, and after preliminary discussion, I find out they have 15, 20 people. Who do they want to go with? One of the top tier vendors in India or East Germany or anywhere else, right? So if you take the vendors out of India, the top 5 all have over 100,000 people. And if you're a company and your size is 15, 20 FTEs, that is full-time equivalents that you're offshoring, guys here, you're not going to get the same level of attention from the other side because you're not as important to them. Not that they really want to ignore you, it is just relative size. Same thing is true if you're working with IBM today. They all have certain minimum sizes of projects or deals that they want to do. So what do you want to be doing? So you want to pick a company, one of the factors, not the factors, one of the factors is to work with a company that for whom you are a meaningful part of their business portfolio. I'll give you an example. Let's say you are writing a contract for $1 million. And if the other side as in your service provider, if their size is say $10 or $15 million, right away, you are a big enough client. You get the right attention, you get the right service. That's a very important factor I have found. And I found that time and time again, when I get invited to come in and do reviews, the fundamentals have not been set in place. So we got to go review whether this vendor at this moment is the right person for this particular client or not. Okay, but on the other hand, if you're starting out, knowing this, you could get started right away in the right fashion. I'm going to skip over to the other side for the vendors. I constantly review responses to RFPs. If I have one point I want to make to you, that is, when I ask the vendors, tell me your core competency, I get big stares. What do you mean? You tell us what you want, we'll make sure it gets done. If I look at 10 proposals from people, 9 out of 10 generally give me that answer. Okay, I'm an expert in object-oriented programming, or I'm an expert in Facebook. But okay, you just give me enough money, I go hire the right people, put things in place. Guys, that's not how it works. You got to be competent in certain areas. The one person who tells us, I am a really expert in this area, gets a huge plus in my mind and in my clients' minds, because you know what you're talking about. You're going to be expert in that area, and we can depend upon you. You may be able to go hire people and do all the other stuff, but that is not compared to somebody who has got a deep experience in one area. That may or may not be the right approach. Okay. Very quickly, the couple of other things in terms of culture. I'll give you a quick example here. IT versus product development. They both have different cultures. If you are the buyer trying to decide upon which vendor, you should be cognizant of that. And clarifying expectations. This has to do with, let's say you say to your vendor, I'm going to grow your account 100 people in the next 2 quarters, and you come in and you're still sitting at 10 or 15. They got to manage their business. And there is a mismatch of expectation. So I think that you really need to make sure those expectations are managed really well. Okay. The next item is to get all stakeholders involved, and Satya will have a few points to make on that one.
Thanks, Sath, and good morning to everyone. I think, Sath, those are really great points that you just discussed. I'd like to just focus on the get all stakeholders involved because I think it has a tremendous impact on the tone of the relationship, the negotiations of the contract, and any issues that come up in the relationship down the road. Baker & McKenzie, it's a global law firm. They do an annual global outsourcing survey. And in the top 5 items that they found from their survey of what are the outsourcing values which are were most significant issues for customers. One of the top 5 ranked was the failure to consult internal stakeholders during the RFP process, resulting in missing and conflicting requirements. So I think it's really important early in the vendor selection process, when you start to zero in on the vendor that you do want to do business with, it's really important to get your internal end users involved, because they will ask the right questions, which will solicit the answers from the service provider, which will give you and help you to gauge whether that's the correct vendor for you. Get the business owners involved, because they're going to set the budget and the expectations. And definitely get your legal team involved, because your legal team, if you have an in-house legal team, that's wonderful, because certainly you can use their resources. But if you don't have an in-house counsel, contact your external counsel and have them step in and listen into those discussions, because they can also provide you tremendous value in terms of pointing out the missteps and some of the pitfalls and the legal and business concerns you should be aware of when you're selecting your vendors. Also, when you get all stakeholders involved, and I should say also from the service provider's angle, you certainly, if you're a service provider, you want to make sure that you have the people with the right skill set in those initial discussions, so that you can give a specific enough response to the customer. And also, if you find from those discussions that that is not within your core competence, the services that are requested, then you can make a reasoned decision whether this is the right fit for you, the right customer for you, or what you need to get up to speed to provide what is needed by the customer. In these initial stakeholder meetings as well, I think one of the key things to kind of ensure that the relationship goes smoothly is to set the right tone. You don't want, neither side wants to approach it aggressively or in too mellow a fashion. As a customer, you certainly want to ask focused questions that will help you evaluate the vendor's capabilities for meeting your specific needs. But at the same time, you don't want to make it so inquisitorial or inquisitive that it might seem that we're getting into an adversarial structure. The benefits of these initial stakeholder meetings can be tremendous. They set more realistic expectations. It helps build trust. It can reduce surprises down the road. It will help your legal team to tailor a master services agreement as well as work orders and statements of work which are more appropriate for the specific needs in the transaction. It will certainly facilitate negotiations. And down the road, when you have issues with the vendor or you have a payment issue, just having had those initial discussions with all the stakeholders can help. I don't say that it always helps, but it's certainly, having had those discussions, it can certainly help to resolve issues amicably. We can go to the next slide.
Okay. Let's talk about project management. So you have gone through vendor selection and all of that, and now you're launching your project. And which projects should you select, and how do you manage the resource and task allocation? That is really the major thrust of this slide here. After putting all the work in to select the right vendor, quite often what I see happen is there are projects that are sent offshore that are almost impossible for any vendor to succeed in. This may surprise many of you, but I find quite a lot of the projects that way, and then the vendor is trying to do their best, but the client is still not happy. So I'll give you an example. If you are starting out with projects that have UI projects, that are user interface projects, for that, you really need to know a lot about how the users in the country, let's say in this case the US, you're sending some projects offshore from US to India or another place, you got to be very conversant with the local culture here. No matter how many times people offshore read about it, see movies about it, etc., it is not the same thing as living in the culture and understanding how the heck it works. And not only that, you can't write everything down and ship all the specs at that level of detail. So you got to first have a set of project selection criteria before you even get started with a set of projects offshore. Okay, UI is really one, and then the second thing that I find is very domain-specific knowledge. If you're starting out a project, people offshore may or may not be very conversant with your particular domain. It takes a while for them to understand your particular company, your domain, how you do business. So you want to be very careful in what projects that you start off with. The other key points to the other part of the checklist here for what projects to select, how much training time does it take? If you put something up there that takes 3 to 6 months, that may not be the best thing that makes the most economic sense for either party. So you got to look at a business case, understand how the whole thing flows together, how it fits together. The other thing that I find quite often is somebody was giving me an example from a networking company here in the Valley. They had just spent 3, maybe 6 months worth of training with people offshore, a team of 15 people. Very specialized networking technology, and the people got up to speed, and this is a real life, I want to say, horror story for everybody. 15 people got trained in this technology, and 3 months into the delivery cycle, all 15 of them got hired by a competitor of the local company. Why? Because it takes 6 months to train somebody in this particular technology, and that particular technology and those skills are very hard to come by in India. So this vendor had gone, invested all the time. Somebody basically came in and made an offer for all 15 people, I should say. And they said, guys, come here, I'm going to double your salary, and the end of discussion. The entire team left. So Lesson learned here is be careful. You don't want to be a sitting duck for somebody else, your own competitor, who may have an offshore presence to come and just poach from you. Don't make it so easy. Think about these kinds of things, and they may not happen to you, but they happen quite a bit in the industry, so I'm passing on some of the lessons learned here. Some of the other things are clearly definable deliverables when you're doing stuff, okay? You can't have water cooler conversations telling everybody, oh, you know, really, I really meant to say this. I really want you to do something more. Those kinds of conversations are really harder. They just won't happen, not harder, right? They just won't happen. So you got to be very clear on what the deliverables will be, how these things get delivered, maybe the design details and all that somebody else offshore can do, but you got to be very clear on what the heck the deliverables are, right? And if you're in terms of task allocation, it depends on the kind of offshoring and outsourcing that you may be doing. Some people have gone to the code development model. In that case, the roles and responsibilities must be really clear as to who does what, and how in terms of resources, how the teams all work together. And again, this becomes very important if you are doing joint development. By the way, one of the concepts that has been used successfully, also although implementation-wise, it's not an easy thing to do, is to 24/7 development. You know, somebody here in the daytime does product development or adds more code is the right way to look at it, because in one day not a huge amount of stuff happens, but then pass it to the QA team offshore, they do the QA, and in the next morning you come back and take a look at the bugs and do bug fixing. It's kind of a nice model, theoretically on paper, but operationally you got to have a lot of discipline to make that happen. It has been made to happen. I work with companies to implement those kinds of things. It gives you not only cost advantage, you are now taking advantage of the time difference as well. So those are some of the things in the case of project management.
So looking at it, these points from a contract and legal perspective, having negotiated several hundred contracts and seeing the kind of disputes that come out of them, and just the amount of time that can be spent to resolve those disputes, I have to say I'm a great fan of checklists and detailed checklists. I also really like to get involved with my clients, whether they're on the customer side or the service provider side, when it comes to the statements of work or the work orders or the project assignments, whatever name you want to call them, but essentially these are the documents that actually describe the services and deliverables and the schedules and the performance expectations. I have to say that a lot of the time legal teams are involved at the master services agreement level and very peripherally involved in the statements of work or work orders. But I think the companies that have had disputes come out of those transactions have realized the value of having legal counsel work with the business teams and the ops teams on reviewing the statements of work and work orders. And that's where the detailed checklists come into picture. I think for both on the customer side as well as the service provider side, it's very good to have, before you develop the work order or statement of work, to have a detailed checklist as to ask the right questions to get the specific scope, the intended objectives, the deliverables, the specifications for the deliverables and the services, the schedule, the task allocation, and if often as it happens, if the scope is not clear or the deliverables, what the deliverables might not be clear, then perhaps the party should consider having a scoping statement of work or project work order as the preliminary step. So take it one step at a time, but the intention really should be to get those details down into the document that's going to describe exactly what services and deliverables need to be provided in that outsourced relationship. And I say that this is really important because I'll give you two examples, one from the customer side and one from the vendor side, as to what I have seen happen. In one case, on the customer side, there was a lot of description about integration with third-party systems, and there had been a lot of discussions behind, outside of the statement of work, about integration with CRM and ERP systems. And the statement of work discussed the integration with the third-party system, but it was really more heavily focused on the ERP side. And the CRM terms were very, very high level, not sufficiently detailed. And it was interesting because, the ERP-related integration happened pretty smoothly, but when it came to the CRM-related integration, as the parties found out, the vendor did not have a deep experience in that type of integration. And as a result, they had not spoken about scoping it out in much detail. And as they started to realize the various issues that were coming out, they also found that they had not priced those specific issues clearly. And so it was a hassle for frustration on both sides. So I think to a certain extent it goes back to the vendor competency slide as well, but I think if the parties had scoped out the details in the project management phase, it would have certainly have helped to reduce those issues. On the vendor side, I have an example where a vendor client of mine essentially had the statement of work, they negotiated that themselves, and they accepted a very broad service scope. And the fees were fixed. And as they realized over time, that what they had expected within the fixed fee scope was not what the customer had expected within the fixed fee scope. And at the end of the deal, and as the transaction proceeded, they were pretty much out of pocket on completing those obligations, because they had a contractual obligation to complete it, but they had not scoped it with sufficient detail to adjust the pricing. You can go to the next slide.
Okay. Okay. So we're going to talk about project deadlines and productivity issues. This is related pretty much to the overall project management, but we're calling this out as a separate slide because of its importance. Setting milestones, that we all do, but what's the key aspect here? You need to think about the kind of, you need to differentiate rather between the key milestones and the task-oriented dates, if you will. In my mind, the way I think about that is a key milestone, maybe a major milestone, a major deliverable, maybe a release date as an example. If you're doing product development, I mean, that may have 10 or 15 different tasks that need to have come together for those things to happen. Now, when you are managing the relationship between you and between the two of you, both the service provider and the buyer of the services, you need to set both those from an operational level. You definitely want the task orientation, but from a big picture level, and then you're tying it down to either rewards or penalties, you want to be at the major milestone. And not only that, you want to make sure that you have senior management involved from both sides to be aware of the major milestones. And in order to make sure that you're meeting those, progress reports, I find, there are lots and lots of different channels for keeping track of what's happening given today's technology, where we are all globally distributed and we can do even things like what we are doing this morning. Now, I encourage people to make sure that the people, the teams offshore, and then the people who are project managers here have at a very minimum once a week detailed discussion about project status, more frequent if you are getting up to your deadline. And not only that, you need to have very clear escalation path for both sides. You need to know who to go to or what kinds of issues you should go to. And by the way, I find quite often the service providers being reluctant to escalate an issue. Quite often there's a cultural issue as well, that they don't choose to do that. But I'm a strong believer in getting the issues out in the open sooner than later, because at the end of the day, if things are not met, nobody is really happy. Okay, so the other key point I want to talk about here is for service providers, quite often say yes. They are really for culturally not wanting to say no. I would rather the service provider say, boss, this can't be done for this, this, and this reason. And the other key concept I want to promote here is under-promise and over-deliver. That works quite well, but 90% of the time I see almost the opposite, and that creates lots and lots of friction. Now, in terms of productivity here, here is a direct quote that I find from many of the operating level managers. Basically, this happens quite often when they're getting started. The people offshore still are relatively new at it, and right after we are written the contract, they're launching the project, and into month number 1 or 2 or 3, I get called in, and then they close the door and say, Sath, what the heck are we doing? So what's the problem? My guys here can do the work for 2 or 3 people offshore. And why in the world are we really doing this? Where is the productivity? This is such a big difference. You talk about cost differential. If 2 people job can be done by 1 person here. Show me where is the cost differential. Okay, where are the savings? You know, initially that may be true, and I find that the people offshore are very hardworking. They put in a very intelligent. They put in a lot of time, but at the same time, here are the key things that contribute towards productivity. You need to pick the right project to start with. Okay, that's very key. I covered that, how to do that earlier. You need to pick the right staff to go with that, right level of training from both sides, and the right kind of staff to begin with. Then you can set up some meaningful incentives. We have done that in several clients. You can set up incentives at the group level, individual level. Just the same concept here is the same thing as key contributors in the US getting rewarded. I would hasten to add, you need to do that in the right legal format. Otherwise, Satya can describe to you some of the things that side effects or undesired side effects that may happen. But you can, in fact, set up meaningful incentives. And for productivity over the long haul, by the way, my experience is productivity settles down after you have been at it for some period of time. There is always some frictional loss or systemic loss that will happen. You probably are not going to have a one-to-one between the US and any place offshore just because of time difference, culture, and all those things. But it can be made to come pretty close. But one of the other things I'm a strong believer is in regular audits. Over time, people change, processes change, everything changes, and you may have had successes to start with. However, to keep things going and making sure that your initiative is successful, your productivity is where it really ought to be, you need to conduct regular audits. What do the regular audits do? This is typically, we have done this for a number of clients, and what we have found is suddenly there are on-site offshore ratios are not the way it used to be, and it's costing a lot more money. Or the staff level is not where it really was initially, and it's costing a lot more money. Again, this has to be a win-win for both parties. So what we have found is quick audits about once a year goes a long way to maintain a good relationship between the vendor and also the users of outsourcing, brings out issues into the open, and you can take action. And in many, many cases, what we have found is not only we have improved productivity, we have been able to do two things. For the clients, we have been able to find out, identify areas that they could take more advantage of using offshore resources. For the vendors, it has meant more opportunity than before. So at the end of the day, you can improve productivity, meet deadlines, and all of those by taking regular checkpoints. It doesn't have to be a huge, long, drawn-out affair, but these can be done pretty quickly, and they can take quick stock of where things are and then move on from there to make sure. It's just like you go for a tune-up for your car every so often, right? It's the same concept.
So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the escalation path and the delay penalties, early completion incentive points on the slide. The escalation path, I think, is really important. It's one of the tools to obviously keep whatever services are involved on track. And you want to set it up so that there are project manager level discussions, which might then be escalated to business owners of the project. And then if it doesn't get resolved at that stage, it's further escalated to involve the executive. Essentially, it is making sure that there is sufficient attention on getting the deliverables and critical milestones met. From the other point I'd like to actually add to that escalation, to those escalation levels, is if you're having a multi-country offshoring program, then you may need to also build in layers where there are, based on the region or country, your particular affiliate that is involved for these particular services has an internal escalation program that is built into the overall escalation path, so that there might be at an affiliate level there might be an escalation standard, and then it goes to escalation to the parent level. So there are really two escalation paths that might be needed to one may need to consider when it comes to multi-country offshoring. From the service provider side, the one thing I understand service providers have concerns with is every customer request need not be escalated to the top level executive. So what they want to do is they want to make sure that the process is followed. And from the service provider's perspective, you may want to build in a timeline. If the problem getting the deliverables back on time is not achieved within a day, then it gets escalated to the next level. Or if some issues are not resolved within so many hours, then it gets escalated to the next level. But you might want to build in, from a service provider's perspective, those timelines so that the escalation to the higher levels proceeds only after the initial levels have had an opportunity to get the project back on track. Then focusing down on the delay penalties, early completion incentives, these two, I really view them as trying to get the project back on track. I don't view them as a penalty strictly, and certainly it doesn't rise to the level of the breach is so material that you need to terminate the contract. These are really more intermediate remedies, and really they should be focused on trying to work as a partnership to get the project back on track. And this is where you will want to address through contract provisions in the master services agreement, but also in the statements of work and work orders. You certainly want to keep the flexibility in the master services agreement to address structuring some of these incentives and penalties in the statement of work, because from project to project, the service levels might be different. The level of criticality of certain dates would be different. The nature of the service may be different. So certainly you want to get back on track for missed dates and missed service levels, but exactly what are the essential criteria, what are the measurable metrics, is something that has to be tied to the particular project. And so you want to give flexibility in your master contract, which then points essentially look to the statement of work for certain additional service levels, for certain additional remedies that the parties may want to put in place. When it comes to the kind of penalties and incentives, on the penalty side, you could see it as a reduction in the by a percentage or several percentage points of the fees involved. It may be a withholding of certain amounts of the payment until the deliverables have been delivered or services performed. It may be in the form of service credits, and it may also be in the form of liquidated damages. And counsel can certainly point you to, when it comes to liquidated damages, that they need to be reasonable and they need to be and based on some estimate commensurate to the amount of damages that would be expected. But we'll leave the legalese out for now. Just the focus is that you want to structure in some level of penalties and incentives. On the incentive side, you certainly, they would be structured more as incentives for early performance, or if the service provider exceeds service levels. That is usually the structure I have seen. Oftentimes, customers do say, why should we provide an incentive for what the service provider is supposed to do? And I think that's a reasonable argument, but if the service provider achieves tasks ahead of time, or they outperform the service levels, then that may be you may want to consider using incentives for those actions because it obviously enhances the partnership. One last point from the service provider's perspective, when there are these penalties that are structured into the contract, you probably want to consider negotiating these penalties as an exclusive remedy. And from the customer side, you might find objection to that, but as long as they are reasonable measure of the damages and they specifically relate to performance, meaning that they don't impact other provisions of the contract, such as compliance with laws in general, for example, and the customer is entitled to their termination right. Those might be reasonable grounds on which to seek exclusive remedies. I think we can move to the next slide.
Okay, talking about vendor-employee issues, let's kind of set the context here. You have chosen the vendor, you have started off a bunch of projects here, and the big picture is to, if all is successful, for both sides to leverage this particular approach to the next level, meaning expansion. How do you go about expanding the effort? One is one of the things you really want to make sure is you have identified key personnel in your vendor's employee pool that would help you to maintain the current projects. Not only that, but can they become part of the expansion plan? Now, does the vendor have management personnel identified for you to be able to work with them to make the expansion happen? Okay, so those are some of the key things. And let me quickly move over to the incentives to reduce turnover. Again, I talked about this a little bit earlier. You can set this up for the group level, company level, recognition, and so on. Not only that, people only focus upon the salaries, but what I find is the type of work makes a big, big difference. For example, you start off with the maintenance work in development. If you can give a path for people to move from maintenance to product development at some point in time, that's a big incentive for them to stay with you. Okay, then if this is not something we wish, but it really does happen in real life. Sometimes we actually have to downsize the teams of these team sizes offshore, And if that were to happen, there are some considerations that Satya might want to address.
Right. So on the downsizing issue, I think for a lot of vendors, it's a question about how fast is the downsizing? How fast is the ramp down? How many people am I going to have on the bench before I can move them to other projects? And I think those are very real and reasonable concerns. So as well as on the customer side, it just doesn't make sense to have such a big staff doing something where your demand is reduced tremendously. So I think it's really important to have that foresight at the beginning when you're negotiating the master agreement to consider, are the kind of services that I'm going to request, will they involve any sort of downsizing down the road? And you want to then structure provisions for a potential ramp down. Usually it involves giving some amount of notice to the vendor, and if the notice period is not long enough, then you might find pushback from vendors essentially to address the vendor's cost of having people on the bench, essentially. And in those cases, I have often found that one can negotiate a mitigation of costs to mutual benefit. Next slide.
Now, let's talk about the global teams. I touched on this earlier in this presentation. You have both the provider and the buyers having operations in multiple countries. And when in those situations, you need to pay attention to contractual and legal issues in addition to operational issues. And Satya has some points to make on the contractual and legal side of stuff.
So, you know, when you have a multi-country offshoring proposition, you really need to think it through very carefully, build in sufficient time for the negotiation and the contract process. Oftentimes, clients will come to me and say, let's get this contract done within the next month. And I know in the back of my mind that this is going to take 3 to 6 months. And particularly when it comes to multi-country offshoring, I think it's really important for business owners to understand that timeline. And I think you will see the relevance of it as well as I talk through the slide. So if you are, the question is, you know, if you have affiliates on the customer side as well as affiliates on the vendor side who might perform the services, the real question in the transaction is, you know, who is responsible for what? You know, is the parent responsible or the affiliate responsible on either side? Now, if you're the customer, you want to know which service provider affiliate will perform the services, where they're located, and, you know, which employees are going to perform those services. I think it's really important to know what those entity names are. It's important to know where they're located, because sometimes if there are data transfers, as an example, you might find that you know, they need to comply. They don't have the level of compliance that the parent service provider entity might have. You also want to know who are the actual people on the ground who are going to perform these services, and you want to probably see their resumes and see if they have the necessary skill set. So, you know, it shouldn't be a question of anybody within the service provider group can perform the services. Rather, it should be, you know, let's look into each entity and see whether they have the capability, whether they can comply with all of the internal controls that the customer needs to flow down, and whether the service provider parent entity has sufficient control over those other affiliates. The other thing to keep in mind is the contracting service provider entity responsible for the affiliate's non-compliance? You want to address that certainly in the contract. But also very important and related to that is you want to know whether the service provider entity you're contracting with has sufficient assets, because in the event of enforcing the contract and sued for breach, you want to be able to get the maximum amount of damages that are permitted within the contract, And when you actually execute the award, you need to be able to execute the award against the service provider entity that does have the significant assets. One way, of course, is to avoid that entire question by just making all service provider entities and affiliates jointly and severally liable. But at the same time, just having a boilerplate term to that in the contract may not be sufficient may be sufficient from a legal perspective, but you still want to understand where the assets lie, because just the process of enforcement and executing the award can be so cumbersome. You want to know which parties you're really dealing with here. Then from the service provider's perspective, if you are dealing with a customer under a master agreement which has multiple affiliates, and you might be providing services to multiple affiliates, you want to know who is responsible from the customer side for paying you for your affiliate transactions. Is it the parent of the customer who will be responsible for affiliate payment breaches? And the other issue you want to be concerned about is whether you as a service provider are exposing your company to multiple suits, suits by the parent customer as well as the affiliate entities of the customer. So these are the questions that you want to think through. You want to certainly discuss all of these issues with the counsel, but counsel will also be able to tell you some of the benefits of contracting that might contracting at a master services level agreement and then at an affiliate contract level. There might be certain tax benefits. There might be certain benefits from an enforcement and dispute resolution perspective. And there might be certain benefits of doing affiliate level contracts just to address very unique country-specific legal compliance issues. And very quickly on the foreign laws, compliance, and issues aspect, when you have services provided by a service provider, by an offshore entity, you have to think through a lot of presumptions of local law. For example, intellectual property that's created in India is subject to the presumption that even if it is assigned to a U.S. company, that if it's not exercised within 5 years, the rights to that IP revert to the service provider. So these kinds of presumptions of law you want to override by specifically, expressly referring to the clause in the contract. So there are foreign law issues that you need to consider. There are also U.S.-related laws that you want to consider in terms of your compliance. Export administration regulations are a great example of that. You obviously, if you're if the offshore entity is accessing your data, then there's a deemed export, and you want to make sure that you are not in violation of any export administration regulations here in the U.S. Because of that deemed export, you want to get the right licenses, and it just differs from country to country. The export administration regulations might have a different license requirement based on where the entity, the affiliate of the service provider is located, and the license may not permit a use by one affiliate of the service provider in one country transferring that data over to their affiliate in another country. You might need to get a broader license. So these are all the complex issues that you need to consider when you're doing a multi-country offshoring deal.
Okay.
All right, I think we can open to questions then.
All right, thank you. We'll now open this up for questions. I'd like to remind you that materials will be posted on SlideShare as well as royseuniversity.com relating to this webinar. If you have a question, please type it into the dialog box that's on the right-hand side of your screen. So first question that we have, somebody asked about the effect of the cultural issues that are involved in dealing with many jurisdictions in an offshoring arrangement and how it affects the U.S. party. Would one of you like to address that?
Sure. Let me take a shot at it. Here is what happens. This is a very good question, and I hear this quite often, especially from new managers taking over management offshore outsourcing. I actually have a couple of quotes that it sticks in my mind because I talked to a few managers here recently last week, and it goes something like this. It may not be precise to what he said. He said, Sath, why doesn't my offshore team just say what they really mean? They just can't do the work in the time frame I'm asking them, rather than say yes and still not do it. So that is one question that I got. Another question from a different manager is the second one is a great believer in status reports and weekly meetings, part of a fairly large company. And he is coming and telling me something along these lines. Sath, I had a meeting of all the people on both sides of the ocean. We even had video conference, went over all the project details. No one from the offshore team spoke up, assumed that there were no further issues. And we have been now having this thing periodically, but this was my final meeting, and I'm a week out from the release, and this is the major deadline. And the day before integration has to happen, my team offshore comes and tells me I cannot meet the deadline. Now, I don't know how many of you have been at the receiving end of this news, and I have been there quite a few times myself. And needless to say, my client manager is really upset. There's an understatement. Now, he added one more thing. Sath, what in the world am I supposed to say to my boss? In fact, I use much stronger words, as you might imagine, but I'm boiling it down for you guys. That was the substance of it. Guys, these are two examples of cultural differences, and it isn't, I don't find that the people offshore maliciously, intentionally mislead project managers here. That's not the intent. And there are a couple of issues here. Is when you're working in multicultural environment, which is what this is, both parties really need to understand what the other party really means. For example, in the U.S., we are so used to coming direct to the point. We say what's on our mind, and then move on. Right? But it is not the case in many cultures outside the U.S. There is a lot of preamble, a lot of time before you really get to the final point, and quite often them not saying yes, them simply saying silent doesn't mean it's an yes. We automatically assume that it is an yes. So culture plays a major role in managing offshore teams, and I find this pretty interesting. I have run workshops for people who have been outsourcing for half a dozen years, from the executives all the way down to the managers, and I continue to get surprised even after 5 or 6 years of them managing offshoring. Culture continues. Some of the things that we discuss are still major shockers for many people. Over time, though, them beginning to understand, things stabilize. But how do you do between the time you get started, even after 4 or 5 or 6 years? I find these issues, and my recommendation to you guys is there are a lot of resources out there. Get some resources, help the teams to understand how to work in multicultural environments, and whatever time that you invest in it will go a really long way to make the whole program a lot more successful. Okay, Satya, do you have anything to add to that?
I think just from a contract perspective, depending on which country the offshoring entity is and where their lawyers are located, I have found that if it's an outsourcing deal with Chinese lawyers involved versus an outsourcing deal with Indian lawyers involved, the negotiation is very different. The points that might be of concern to the entities can be very different for the same general transaction. Just the style of negotiating can be different. So it's always helpful to work with counsel who has had experience with negotiating with lawyers in those jurisdictions so that they can avoid certain pitfalls during the negotiation process.
Okay, thank you. Well, I see that we're at the bottom of the hour. It's 12:30, so I'm going to go ahead and conclude the presentation. I'd like to thank all you folks for joining. I'd especially like to thank our two panelists, Sath and Satya, today, and we look forward to hearing from you.